Croeso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 220, Crime and Social Conformity in Wales. Social norms are an important measure for us to understand what is happening in Wales in the early Victorian period. Laws and control have always been a bit difficult to manage. Keep in mind that up until probably, I would say, the 18th century, there isn't really what we would consider to be a normal justice system. There's not a police force. Shire reeves are mostly built to, or as we would terminology call them sheriffs, are not necessarily police officers as such. Bailiffs have a role to play in it, but they're not necessarily the image of what we would normally consider to be a normal justice system. But all of them have parts of them that work to create what we consider to be the normal justice system as it exists in the modern day. But at this point, or up until this point, I should say, they're more of an effective paramilitary force that has some judicial duties. They carry out the justice that is needed to be carried out. They are the ones who usually arrest people. They're typically the ones who are putting people in jail or carrying out different kinds of punishments. And if we look at especially prior to 1830 in the greater sessions, which you can actually see all of the convictions that are done via the great sessions and the lesser sessions that happen in Wales from about the mid 1700s till the early 1800s. The one thing that becomes pretty clear is decision making and prosecutions were done completely differently than we think of them today. You can have incidences where people are judged and convicted of things, but given lesser forms of punishment than maybe we would mete out, or in some cases greater forms of punishment than we would mete out. You know, you kind of expect the one, you don't necessarily expect the other, which I think is interesting and somewhat fascinating to see. As examples, some of the things I noticed is one person was convicted of a crime. If the crime was murder, typically if they were convicted, they were executed. But if it was something along the lines of even stealing, if it was perceived as being bad enough, you could be executed for that too. Typically, though, those would pile up with a list of other things. There wouldn't just be one crime. It would be a multiple level or multiple crimes kind of adding up to this situation. But interestingly, it didn't necessarily mean that you couldn't receive capital punishment for things that would not normally have received capital punishment in later years. Another thing in this mix, which I thought was quite fascinating to see, was the prosecutor of the case was typically the person who was done wrong. So it wasn't some judicial person that you would expect, a solicitor or a lawyer, depending on where you live and how you would look at it. But this was done by, the local tailor who got robbed, or, the family member of the person who may have been injured or whatever. So there was a stake in the actual conviction. So they may have lined up things a little differently. Certainly you can kind of see in how the decisions were made that those people would definitely have a reason for wanting conviction. And some occasions they got it and some occasions they didn't. And like I said, some of the decision making was very interesting. I mean, sometimes the people convicted were as young as 11 in the cases of some of the arrests that were made in Carmarthenshire in the later half of the century, which we're going beyond the Welsh version of this. And they would get anything from jail time to whippings. And same for some people, like if you stole from someone, it was very common that you would get jail time or you would get a lashing, as they would call it, but also you could get punished in other ways. In one case, I saw one instance where the young man was actually sent overseas, probably to Australia for 7 years, to work basically as a penal colonist. And likely once you go that far away, you're not coming back. That was kind of the methodology that was used, and the decision making was very unusual, shall we say, and very much kind of didn't make a lot of sense. It seemed to be a bit arbitrary at times, which I think must have been very frustrating. But this is the problem when you're not if you're in a community where there is a large proportion of criminality, those that are being judged are not going to get the benefit of the doubt compared to, say, the white collar crime level, if you want to call it that. And this was the reality for a lot of people. If you stole stuff in this age, very likely you were going to receive pretty severe punishment. Didn't always happen. Like I said, there were cases that were let off for reasons that unfortunately we don't know because it's not detailed enough in the full breakdown of why. But I think it's an interesting sort of way to look at things and to study things, to kind of figure out where we're going with this kind of stuff. And you're seeing society is struggling with trying to deal with a number of different things in this period, one of which is how do we deal with growing urbanality in areas that weren't urban before. And we're going to bring up a good example of this in just a few minutes, and how do you deal with the consequence of that? And how do you deal with having to do legal justice as opposed to what previously was amounting to, if I was to be blunt, mob rule / one person rule, where they would effectively decide all the cases, and in some cases the mob would carry out justice to deal with problematic people of different types. So with all that said and done, let's kind of get into it, and we'll talk more in depth about some of the Welsh examples. Now, some said Wales in this period was unruly and crime was everywhere, pointing to social protests, labor protests, strikes as example of instances of people breaking the law, the Rebecca riots being a fine example of this. But that doesn't really, I don't think that's a fair shake, because we're not talking about crime in the same sense we would. It's more like popular protest, and popular protest isn't considered a crime normally. Now, obviously, if it leads into mob violence, it's going to definitely be that. I would call the Scotch cattle types much more criminal element than, say, the Rebecca riots, which were typically done to non-people and typically done to protest a tax which they were unhappy with. Now, that may just be me giving them the benefit of the doubt. It may be just as violent and just as upsetting to those of the social order, but the reality of it is I don't look at those at the same level. I don't think most people nowadays would. It's equivalent of saying that someone who protests, say, in a climate change protest, or someone who maybe looking back at the 60s was protesting in the civil rights movement, is on the same level as someone who murdered someone or someone who stole from someone. And I don't think you can make those quantifications similar. So while yes, in our modern definition, they can be crimes, I think it's much clearer that that's not the kind of thing that we would consider a crime, but they definitely did in that period. So when you hear, especially from that era, people talking about criminals and criminal cases, you have to include those kind of things in it, because that's what they included. That's kind of important to realize. This was, of course, argued against by those who are looking at this from the Welsh side of things. And let's be honest, they put the blame of the crime that was happening on the usual suspects. They were not pure Welsh, as an example. They were immigrants who came into our country and messed things up. They were vagabonds. They were ne'er-do-wells who planned things from other countries. There was organized crime that had come in from other places. Now, when I say other countries, we're including England, Ireland especially, and Scotland. Ireland, unfortunately, gets a large target because there is a larger proportion of Irish people moving into these communities, and so they get targeted. So keep that in mind when we talk about this, and we'll bring up again a little bit later. But the whole idea of these people stirring up trouble just reminds us all that that kind of mentality doesn't go away. It still exists today. There's still loads of people that look at crime as it can't have been us, it must have been the outsider. And the reality of it is it's always both. I mean, sure, there are outsiders that come in and cause trouble, but they're not a big percentage any more than it's a big percentage of the entire population. But we still cause our own problems. We still commit our own crimes. We still commit things that are awful and horrible and create lots of crime dramas and podcasts because of it. So there is, true crime dramas, to put it that way. But that kind of stuff is something that is very popular to sort of argue it's not us, it's them, whoever them is, because then it works to your benefit from the standpoint of being able to say, hey, we didn't cause this, we didn't do it, it's not us, we're sweet and innocent. And there is this kind of sentiment that goes out to say, as if I was to be blunt, to say that the Welsh were too innocent to commit these crimes, and the only reason why they're committing these crimes is because the mean immigrant is convincing them to. fill in the blank with who you want to call the immigrant. Is it an Irish person? Is it an English person? Is it a Scottish person? Is it somebody from somewhere in Europe who's come back? I don't know, but that seems to be the perception that Welsh people were truly innocent. And I get where it's coming from. It's a defense against the idea that was percolating, especially in this era, that the Welsh were particularly criminal, that they had a tendency to be criminal. And the problem is there's some evidence to say that there was a lot of criminality in Wales, but there's some justification as to why this happens, and we are going to discuss it. So keep in mind that there's both sides, and both sides will argue, both from a nationalistic and from a larger British perspective, that will say, both things are happening, and both can be right and wrong at the same time. So we always, of course, look at it from that lens. And so keep in mind that for every image of Wales as the devilish person who creates all these problems, there's also the other side, which is like, the innocence of humanity in Wales, and that the Welsh were really just done dirty by, fill in the blank person who moved there. And we see this happen with the Blue Books, the that we've talked about the last couple of episodes, the concept that the Welsh population is morally bankrupt, and that it is the job of England to try and purify and make this race, in quotes, a noble one. So in order to do that, we got to make them English, basically. And in the case of the Welsh, they turned around on its head. If they got accused of having women who were sexually active, for lack of a better phrasing, they would come back and say, oh no, but mothers are the purity of the household. They are the angels of the household. So they're sainted people. They're not devils. They're not out there committing these acts that you're describing. They're the center of the family. And so there was both sides of this argument, and it was never uncommon for both sides to bring this up. So keep that all in mind as we talk, and recognize that obviously somewhere in the middle is where we're likely going to end up with a lot of this stuff. And the reality of the numbers speak that crime in Wales was not uncommon, and that petty crimes were often in the majority in Wales and happened more frequently than they did in England, at least as far as the records that we can go back to. And we're talking about in percentages. Obviously, the percentage of population in England is much bigger than it is in Wales, so it's going to have a higher number, but the proportion is what we're talking about. So keep that in mind as we discuss these kind of things. That could be because there were more crimes recorded due to more effective criminal justice systems, or it could be that there was more crime because the populations were becoming more compressed, and in some areas, the poor and their rural compatriots were finding themselves in more and more unhealthy and in worse economic circumstances. So therefore, they were very much concerned about this. This was something they were always kind of having problems with. As an example, in 1861, Cardiff had become a place noted for being the center of crime in Wales. 1 in 15 of their citizens were in some sort of legal trouble. One thing was clear: things were definitely not restricted to a few bad apples, and it wasn't restricted to the so-called vagrancies and immigrants that had come to Wales. Of the crimes that were committed, about 1/3 to 2/3 were arrests for drunkenness, assaults, stealing, vagrancy, malicious destruction of property. Drunken behavior and assaults were the leading cause and issue of these problems. Murder and manslaughter generally remained sparse, but this did not mean that violence was not the norm for some. Violent assaults were not centered only in Cardiff, Swansea, Merthyr, and other urban centers. They were also something that happened across the entire nation. Clashes over family disputes, sexual assaults, battles against neighbors, and even with the police made up a great proportion of the violence that would happen. And in the early 19th century, it was thought that Carmarthen was the most violent town in all of Europe. But if that was the case, they were not alone, and I don't know how you determine that. I think that's basically a supposition rather than an actuality. Anti-immigrant riots were also a feature of the criminal activity in the latter half of the century, as locals tried to force out the Irish and English families from the valley. These were not isolated incidents, as they could involve up to 1,000 people, depending on the situation, and definitely were violent in nature. We talked a number of episodes ago about Merthyr Tydfil and how it changed from the beginnings of the late 18th century to the middle of the 19th century, and how the population expanded from an empty farmland in the valley into something around 7,705 at 1801, but then blossomed by 1851 to 43,378, and a few years later would reach over 50,000 people living in the community. As it grew, so did the congestion of people living in smaller housing with less distance between the neighbors and with more people living in these houses. One of the drivers of this boom was the completion of the canal to Cardiff, which started industrialization. It allowed for product to be made in Merthyr and then shipped down and out into the Bristol Channel, which then allowed it to go out to the rest of the empire. Because really that was what they were doing. They weren't necessarily selling to other people outside of the UK and its empire. However, it was the Taff Valley Railway, which, when it was completed in 1841, that really allowed the industry to continue to flourish, because it would increase the amount of things that could be sent out. It was much quicker than sending it through ship methods and boat methods and canal boats, because simply it could carry so much more and so much quicker. And because of that, it became the key feature. And as the years would go on, of course, because it didn't have access to the sea, Merthyr would start to fall off in the latter half of the century. But at that point, that was when it was at its peak, and that was why, because of these two things happening at the same time. Along with that, there was a reduction of available housing, because, of course, things started to boom. And whenever you have booms, one of the first things to come into issue is the fact that you would have not enough time to build the housing required to meet the demand of people moving in. As more and more people came out from the rural areas, as more people moved in from other communities and other parts of the UK, you would have this growing demand for housing, and especially in such a short period of time. I mean, you're talking about in a few years going from 7,000 to 43,000. That is really fast in the UK at this time for what amounts to a 50-year period. That's just not normal. And so we kind of look at it from our lens, and it seems like it's something that, well, that could happen. I mean, there's an area of my city that went from 0 people to 50,000 in less than 10 years, but that's not normal, and it certainly isn't normal at this time in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, that just didn't happen. You didn't have, little hamlets become towns, become cities within such a short period of time. It just wasn't normal, because there wasn't, up until now, massive population booms and a movement away from the largest driving workplace, which was agriculture. And so you have this combination of industrialization focusing in on the same point as population growth is exploding, and you have this mass migration into urban areas, creating problems for those urban areas, because now you have to meet the requirements of these urban areas. And yes, they didn't have plumbing the way we do. They didn't have electricity to pipe in. They didn't have all the normal things that we expect, but yet they still had necessities that had to be done. You couldn't just plop up a house in the middle of nowhere and hope for the best and make it work like you might have done in times past. And so you have to have coordinated and organized situations, which then leads to demand. And as demand continues and they can't keep up, they're building in smaller and smaller envelopes. Houses are going up in more compressed conditions. And on top of that, the streets are narrowing. Everything's getting closer and closer. And combined with all that, you're having more and more people that are moving into the city who maybe have come in because they've had a relative who's moved there and said, hey, there's jobs here. And so they move in with a relative. Well, all of a sudden now you have more and more people moving in with less and less housing accommodation. And so you have homelessness starting, you have all these other problems, and then combine it with, and we will discuss this in greater detail later, medical issues which start to crop up because of this urban and kind of lack of sprawl, more like urban glut in these areas. And so because of these tight housing areas, diseases would spread really fast. And in ways that couldn't have been anticipated in previous times and would be disastrous for these areas. So again, all of this is kind of happening very quickly in a very quick amount of time. In 50 years, basically, you're seeing Wales suddenly go from what amounted to a rural backwater to a very industrialized area, which is bringing in tons and tons of business and money and wealth to some, and massive amounts of demand for employment and wages. And all of that is just overwhelming for so much of the urban areas. And Merthyr is a fine example of it because it is the one that goes from 0 to 60 in seconds and has to deal with the consequences of that. Along with this reduction of available housing, as I said, it meant that people ended up homeless. This would, of course, create the crowded conditions that would create the medical consequences, as we mentioned. But there's other aspects to having this poorer housing. I mentioned when we talked about the rise of the valleys and kind of the creation of Merthyr, that there was an area where people settled at first, but these houses weren't great because they were kind of the first slapdash things put up. And then people moved away from them, and then other people kind of moved in, and the other people moving in didn't buy the place. They just kind of took them over. This area becomes a place which is called Chinatown at the time. And it was a slum area in the Pont storehouse area of Merthyr. And it's not Chinatown after the modern sense, as its residents were usually English, Irish, and Welsh. The inhabitants of this area were seen as a separate class, away from the so-called respectable areas of Merthyr, and were clearly recognized by their lifestyle and appearance. And because of this, there's a description of them which basically says that they were areas that were worse than or equivalent to little Sodom and Gomorrahs, to use the biblical term, and that there was a obvious problem. I read a couple of historians which brought up the fact that there was a large amount of prostitution, as example, that would happen there. Prostitution wasn't necessarily held as being illegal at the time, so it wasn't considered criminal, but it was a moral problem. So people looked at that as being an indication of an area that's bad. And then, of course, there was other problems that went along with this. There were at least 1,500 people living in this slum, and the inhabitants were some of the poorest in society, and because of that had gained a bad reputation, and their living conditions were some of the most squalid in all of Britain. In the community of Merthyr, the population was 80% Welsh and about 9% Irish, and the rest was a mixture of various communities throughout the UK and elsewhere. This was a time when Merthyr was the center of iron production, which meant that the demand was high and work and wages were generally good. For the first few years of the 1840s, it was a boom town that created wealth and success for at least a few and created stable wages and stable livings for a lot of others. However, if you ever lived in boom times, then you know that busts that come after them are pretty ugly. And from 1847 to 1852, Merthyr entered into a depression. At its height, there were 20,000 men unemployed in Merthyr, which means almost 50% of the population was out of work, and likely, if you just looked at work-aged people, it was probably even worse. Of course, that definition's a bit slanted because work age could even be as low as 10 years old. So, nonetheless, that's 20,000 people out of work. And that's massive, which is obviously a staggering figure. If you look at Merthyr in current time, the unemployment rate is 3.5% by comparison. And if we reach 10%, everybody would be shocked and appalled, and there'd be calls for the government intervention because of the consequence it would have on the local economy. These economic hard times, of course, were not balanced with social housing, medical insurance, payments to protect people, homelessness mitigation, or any of the normal things that we think about today that would go about, government projects and plans, employment schemes. All these normal things that we expect of our government didn't exist or were not by any means as formal or as functional as they are today. Certainly we see in Victorian Britain there is a level of social responsibility which is coming out, but it's usually done on a volunteer basis, on a volunteer donation basis. It's rarely ever done by the government itself, and it's poorly controlled and poorly managed for the most part. And if you didn't live in a major center, your likelihood of seeing any real protection from the worst of the situations was fairly narrow, and I would argue that in these places it's probably non-existent. Along with this, of course, when you have these situations where you have decreasing employment, to go along with it, as we saw in the 1830s and 1820s, they would also cut your wages, which meant that not only did you have those that were unemployed, but even the ones that were employed that were lucky to keep their jobs would find that their jobs would decrease in the amount of money they got. And you can be sure that, much like every other instance, the cost of living didn't go down to meet the cut in wages or the loss of employment. So your expenses stayed the same, but your ability to pay those expenses decreased, in some cases by half, and in some cases by all. So you can see why this is developing into desperation, why there are strikes, why there are demonstrations, why there's so much protest against either the industry or the government. Because of this, this is what leads to reform and change and various other things. But as well, it does lead desperate people to start looking for ways to feed their families or to take advantage of their wealthier neighbors and businesses the only way they knew how, which was to seek their own way out. And because of this, we see several instances where in Wales you find consequences for this, things that happen that create more and more criminal activity. As you can imagine, alcohol would fuel some of it, because a lot of the violence and especially assaults on people would happen. There was an accusation that alcohol had a lot to do with that. Again, it's hard to say, but that certainly wouldn't be a surprise. And because of all this, by 1847, the Merthyr Police District had grown to 19 men. This is the rise of when we get policing as opposed to the previous way of doing things. In part because of the local protests and everything, they started to realize that they needed more boots on the ground. They needed people who had an understanding of the community rather than just sending the militia out to more or less read the riot act and bump heads. They needed people that could actually intervene before things got bad. And so they started to bring this in. And we'll talk about it in further detail because it does start to happen in the latter half of the century, much more organized, much more what we would identify as a police force would come out of that. And to show you how bad things had gotten, it had been estimated that as many as 2 to 3 of every 100 people living in Merthyr and Aberdare were arrested annually. And that crime waves peaked in the early 1840s, funny enough, in the middle of the good times, and in 1847 to 48, and then again early and late in the 1850s. And because of this, you see the waves going up and down, but they're going up and down in part because of this change to the situation and circumstance that everybody's seeing. As financially it gets more difficult, people are trying to look for different ways to meet that challenge. And, of course, crimes were caused typically by poverty. These were, of course, associated with vagrants and beggars, but realistically, when you looked at it, it also dealt with a lot of people who were just desperate, and they were looking for ways to finance themselves, to sell things to others, to get money to buy things, or they would just steal the necessities. A great majority of, say, thieves that were women had been stealing clothes, food, and some of which they would sell on to others to make some money to pay for things. And this became a rising problem. The next thing that they kind of point out, and this especially was the case during the downtime, is that stealing coal was very popular, especially from the iron makers and iron masters, because those were the areas where coal was being used quite a lot. So that would obviously have a big pile of coal. So you would steal from them in order to finance either to heat your homes, but also it could be used as sort of a black market material to gain other, you could sell it on for less cost. So you can see how it's something that could happen and would happen quite frequently. And people would be stealing it even if they worked there. So this created massive amount of problems for the communities and for the industry. But frequently, it wasn't the only thing. Like I said, drunkenness and assaults were fairly common. There were, at times, large proportions of beer and alcohol being consumed by various people, and that meant both men and women, and there were men and women who were notorious criminals in that period and caused massive amounts of trouble because of it, and the police would have to deal with them. And quite honestly, assaults were one of the biggest things that people got charged for. About 1/3 of criminal cases at times were assaults. And so violence, usually in these cases, were not so uncommon, but yet probably fueled by alcohol, by desperation, by rage, and all the other things that go along with that. And then the other category that seemed to come up quite frequently, of course, was sexual crimes, be they prostitution or rape or all of those other offenses that you find in these circumstances and situations, which have lasting effects on people and certainly would be of a massive problem for society. And all of these things really are at the center of problems even today, and largely are driven initially, I would argue, through poverty, through various issues within society that need to be dealt with and that we struggle to deal with even now, let alone back in the Victorian period, where they either didn't understand what was going on or didn't care about what was going on because there wasn't a common understanding of what was driving it, or a common understanding or willingness to actually be sensitive to or to try and deal with the problem in a way that made sense. And with all of that said and done, we've only really scratched the surface of all this. We will certainly be talking a lot more about crime and about consequences. And one thing we haven't really brought up, which is the social conflicts that come out of that, how frequently social conformity would become an issue, and how the use of mob rule had developed ways to enforce social conventions and constrictions on people. And we're certainly not talking about religious social conformity. We're talking about actual society saying, hey, what you're doing isn't right, and so the police won't do anything, so we will. And that kind of stuff did go on and was a popular method for dealing with problematic, in quotes, people. And all of that we will talk about in the future. And with all that said and done, if you have any questions, comments, and concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or you can always reach out to me on social media at Welsh History Pod, on Twitter, or if you want to call it X, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast, or you can help me via Patreon at patreon.com/Welsh History. That does help with the research that I do for this podcast. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Hope you have a brilliant day. We will talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.